He called 911 at 3 in the morning, his voice breaking through static and panic, insisting his wife had vanished. But when police arrived at the honeymoon suite scattered with rose petals and half-empty champagne glasses, they found something far more disturbing than a missing person. There was no record she had ever existed at all. No wedding photos on his phone, no identification in her suitcase, no witnesses who remembered seeing her face. And when detectives asked him the simplest question a husband should be able to answer, he stared at them with hollow eyes and whispered words that would haunt the investigation for years to come. "I don't remember her name." This is the story of Ethan Crawford, a man who went on honeymoon with the woman he loved, only to return alone to a world that insisted she had never been real. It's a story about memory, guilt, and the terrifying possibility that the person sleeping beside you might be nothing more than a ghost you created yourself. And it begins 6 months earlier in Seattle, where two people fell in love under circumstances that should have been perfect. Should have been. But perfection, as we'll soon discover, is often just another word for something carefully hidden. Ethan Crawford was 32 when he met Claire Bennett at a photography exhibition in downtown Seattle. Friends who attended their wedding described them as inseparable, the kind of couple that made you believe in soulmates. Their vows were exchanged on a cliff top overlooking Puget Sound, with 40 guests bearing witness to what everyone agreed was genuine, undeniable love. But if you watch the wedding video closely, you'll notice something strange. Claire appears in almost none of the footage. When the camera pans across the reception, she's somehow always just out of frame. When guests posed for group photos, she politely declined, claiming she wasn't photogenic. At the time, it seemed like shyness. Looking back, it seems like something else entirely. Ethan worked as a software engineer for a mid-sized tech company. Quiet, reliable, the kind of employee who never caused problems. His co-workers remember Claire visiting the office once, bringing him lunch on his birthday. They remember her warmth, her laugh, the way she touched his shoulder when she spoke. They remember everything except what she actually looked like. One colleague would later tell detectives she had brown hair. Another swore it was blonde. A third insisted Claire had worn glasses, though no one else recalled that detail. It was as if people's memories of her were somehow incomplete, like trying to remember a dream that fades the moment you wake up. The honeymoon destination was Ethan's choice. The Cliffside Inn, a remote coastal resort in Rockport, Maine. Built in the 1920s, the hotel sat on a stretch of rocky shoreline where cell phone signals died and the nearest town was 12 miles away. It was the kind of place people went to disconnect from the world, or to disappear from it entirely. They checked in on October 15th, a Thursday evening, as fog rolled in from the Atlantic. The receptionist, a woman named Margaret Chen, who'd worked at the inn for 17 years, would later testify that she processed the reservation for room 214. One room, 2 guests. She remembered Ethan's signature on the registration form. She had no memory of the woman standing beside him. Before we continue this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happens next in Ethan's story will challenge everything you think you know about memory, identity, and the lengths people will go to bury the truth. The next morning, October 16th, Ethan appeared alone at breakfast. The dining room overlooked the ocean, where waves crashed against black rocks beneath a gray sky. He ordered coffee and asked the server if she'd seen his wife. She hadn't. No one had. By 11 o'clock, Ethan was pacing the lobby, approaching staff members with growing desperation. His wife had gone for a walk, he explained. She'd left their room around 8. She wasn't answering her phone. Had anyone seen a woman in her early 30s wearing a blue jacket, with hair that was either brown or blonde, depending on who you asked? The hotel manager, Raymond Torres, checked the guest registry. Room 214 was registered to Ethan Crawford. Single occupancy, no mention of a spouse, no second name on the reservation. Torres assumed there had been a miscommunication, perhaps a girlfriend who'd left early after an argument. These things happened at romantic getaways. But Ethan's panic was too raw, too genuine to dismiss. At 2:30 that afternoon, Torres called the local police. Officer Sarah Kemper arrived first, followed 20 minutes later by Detective Luis Morales from the state police. They found Ethan sitting on the edge of the hotel fountain, his hands shaking, his eyes red from crying, or lack of sleep, or both. He told them everything in fragments that didn't quite connect. They'd arrived together yesterday evening. Claire had loved the room, especially the view. They'd shared wine on the balcony, made love, fallen asleep holding each other. When he woke this morning, she was gone. Her suitcase was still there, her toiletries in the bathroom, but she had vanished. Detective Morales asked for Claire's full name. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The silence stretched for 15 seconds. Finally, he whispered that he couldn't remember, that the stress was making his mind blank, that of course he knew his own wife's name, but he couldn't say it. They checked his phone. No photos of Claire. No text messages. No calls. Ethan insisted they'd taken pictures, dozens of them. But when Morales scrolled through the camera roll, there were only landscapes. The Seattle skyline, his coffee cup, an empty chair at a restaurant where Ethan swore Claire had been sitting. The hotel security footage told an even stranger story. Cameras at the entrance showed Ethan arriving at 7:45 the previous evening. He pulled 2 suitcases from his rental car, walked through the lobby, checked in at the desk. In every frame, every angle, he was alone. There was no woman with brown or blonde hair, no blue jacket, no Claire. Detective Morales had been working missing persons cases for 14 years. He'd seen marriages fall apart on vacation, seen people stage disappearances to escape debt or relationships or themselves. But he'd never seen someone truly believe in a person who left no evidence of existence. The conviction in Ethan's eyes wasn't the look of a liar. It was the look of someone watching reality crack apart. They searched room 214. Rose petals on the bed, recently scattered. 2 champagne glasses, both with lipstick stains. A woman's suitcase containing clothes, shoes, makeup, all neatly packed. But no identification, no wallet, no credit cards, no passport, nothing with a name. And when they dusted the glasses for fingerprints, they found Ethan's on both of them. The lipstick stains had been applied by his own hand, though he had no memory of doing so. The suitcase belonged to him as well, filled with women's clothing he'd purchased online over the past 3 months, using accounts he didn't remember creating. The rose petals had been ordered through the hotel concierge by Ethan for a romantic surprise for himself. By midnight, the working theory was clear. Ethan Crawford had experienced some kind of psychotic break. He'd created an elaborate fantasy honeymoon for a wife who didn't exist, then called police when the delusion collapsed. It was tragic, certainly, but not criminal. He would be evaluated by psychiatric professionals, treated, hopefully recovered, except for one detail that didn't fit. The second champagne glass, the one covered in lipstick that Ethan had supposedly applied himself, had a partial fingerprint on the stem that didn't match his. The print was small, distinctly feminine, and when run through databases, it came back with a match that changed everything. The fingerprint belonged to a woman named Lila Reeves. And Lila Reeves had been missing for exactly 5 years, 2 months, and 6 days. Ethan Crawford's previous engagement had ended without ceremony or explanation. Friends knew he'd been planning to marry someone named Lila, a graphic designer he'd met through work. The wedding was scheduled for June 12th, 5 years ago. Invitations had been sent. A venue booked. Lila's parents had flown in from Michigan 3 days before the ceremony, and then Lila simply wasn't there anymore. Ethan told everyone she'd gotten cold feet, left him a note saying she needed space, that she wasn't ready for marriage. Her apartment had been cleared out, her social media accounts deleted, her phone disconnected. It seemed like a cruel but not uncommon story. A bride who ran. Her parents filed a missing person report. Police investigated briefly, found no signs of foul play, concluded Lila was an adult who'd chosen to disappear. It happened more often than people realize. The case went cold. Now, 5 years later, Lila's fingerprint had appeared on a champagne glass in a hotel room where Ethan claimed to be honeymoon with a wife named Claire. A wife with no photographs, no identification, no proof of existence beyond Ethan's fractured memories, and a single fingerprint left behind like a signature. Detective Morales pulled Ethan's case file from 5 years ago. He interviewed the original investigators. He tracked down Lila's parents, who still lived in Michigan, still waited for their daughter to call, still believed she was alive somewhere. They provided photos, medical records, a hairbrush with DNA samples. And when Morales showed Ethan those photos of Lila Reeves, something happened that made the detective's blood run cold. Ethan stared at the images for a long moment, his face pale, and whispered that yes, that was her. That was Claire, the woman he'd married, the woman who'd vanished from room 214. But it wasn't possible. Claire and Lila couldn't be the same person, because according to every witness, every photograph, every piece of evidence from 5 years ago, Lila had looked nothing like the woman Ethan described. Different hair color, different height, different voice. Unless Ethan had never seen Lila clearly at all, unless somehow he'd been in love with a ghost of his own creation for far longer than anyone realized. The psychiatric evaluation took place at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. Dr. Patricia Wong, a specialist in dissociative disorders, spent 6 hours with Ethan across 3 sessions. Her report painted a picture of a man trapped between 2 realities, neither of which fully made sense. Ethan insisted his memories were real. He could describe Claire's voice, her laugh, the way she took her coffee. He could recall conversations they'd had, places they'd gone together, intimate moments that felt too specific to be fabricated. But when pressed for concrete details, names of restaurants, dates of events, everything became vague and contradictory. Dr. Wong noted that Ethan's description of Claire changed subtly throughout their conversations. Sometimes she had brown eyes, sometimes blue. Sometimes she was taller than him, sometimes shorter. It was as if he was describing a composite, a collection of traits that had never quite solidified into a single consistent person. The diagnosis was complicated. Ethan showed signs of dissociative amnesia, possibly triggered by severe trauma. But there was also evidence of elaborate confabulation, the brain's attempt to fill gaps in memory with false but believable information. Dr. Wong couldn't rule out the possibility of deliberate deception, though she noted that if Ethan was lying, he'd somehow convinced himself so thoroughly that even polygraph tests came back inconclusive. What Dr. Wong found most disturbing wasn't what Ethan remembered. It was what he'd forgotten. When she asked about Lila, about his previous engagement, Ethan's memories were equally fragmented. He remembered proposing, remembered planning a wedding, but couldn't recall the last conversation they'd had. Couldn't remember what Lila had been wearing the last time he saw her. Couldn't remember where she'd gone. For 3 weeks, Ethan stayed with his brother in Seattle, while Detective Morales continued investigating. The case had attracted media attention. Local news ran as stories about the mysterious Honeymoon disappearance. True crime forums dissected every detail, building theories that ranged from plausible to absurd. Some believed Ethan had murdered both women. Others thought he was a victim of elaborate gaslighting. And then the emails started arriving. The first came to the police tip line on a Monday morning. Anonymous sender, untraceable IP address. The message contained 2 words and a location. Check room 214's basement. Morales contacted the Cliffside Inn. The hotel had no basement. It was built on solid rock, directly on the coastal foundation. Except there was an old storage cellar, sealed off decades ago after flooding issues. The entrance was hidden behind the lobby's coat closet, barely visible behind stacked boxes and forgotten furniture. Torres, the hotel manager, admitted he'd almost forgotten it existed. In 17 years, he'd never had reason to open it. They opened it on a Thursday afternoon. Morales, 2 state troopers, and a forensic team descended a narrow staircase into darkness that smelled of salt water and decay. Their flashlights cut through shadows in the cramped space, revealing rusted shelves, molding cardboard boxes, the accumulated debris of 100 years. And in the far corner, partially hidden behind a collapsed shelving unit, they found a blue tarp wrapped around something human barced in, something that had been there for approximately 5 years. The DNA results confirmed what Morales had already begun to suspect. Lila Reeves had never run away from her wedding. She'd never gotten cold feet or needed space or chosen to disappear into a new life. She'd been murdered, her body hidden in a flooded cellar beneath the same hotel where Ethan had brought his imaginary bride for their honeymoon. The coincidence was impossible. The implications were clear. But Ethan's reaction when they arrested him was not what anyone expected. He didn't deny it, didn't lawyer up, didn't show rage or fear or guilt. He simply looked at Detective Morales with eyes that had gone somewhere else entirely and asked when Claire would be coming home. The murder investigation revealed details that painted Ethan Crawford as either a calculating killer or a deeply fractured mind. Forensic evidence placed him at the Cliffside Inn 5 years ago, though hotel records showed no reservation under his name. A rental car traced to his credit card. Security footage too degraded to be useful, but cellular tower pings that put his phone in Rockport during the weekend Lila went missing. But there was no clear motive, no history of violence, no angry texts or threatening voicemails. Lila's friends described their relationship as stable, loving, normal. The kind of couple that argued occasionally about where to eat dinner, but never about anything serious. Ethan had been devastated when she disappeared. Or at least everyone believed he was devastated. Now those same friends look back on his grief with suspicion. Had he been acting, covering his tracks, or had he genuinely forgotten what he'd done? His mind creating an alternate reality where Lila simply left him rather than died by his hand? Wong was called to testify about Ethan's mental state. She explained dissociative amnesia, how trauma could cause the brain to suppress memories, how someone could commit an act so terrible their psyche refused to acknowledge it happened. It was rare, she admitted, but not impossible. The prosecutor built a case around circumstantial evidence and psychological theory. Ethan had killed Lila, hidden her body, then convinced himself she'd abandoned him. The guilt festered for 5 years until his mind created Claire, a replacement bride, a chance to get their honeymoon right. Returning to the Cliffside Inn had been either supremely arrogant or a subconscious need to confess. Ethan's lawyer argued reasonable doubt. No witnesses. No murder weapon, no confession, just a man with severe mental illness who may have been framed by someone with access to Lila's belongings. The fingerprint on the champagne glass proved nothing except that someone had brought Lila's things to that hotel room. And then, 6 days before trial was set to begin, Ethan received a visitor. The woman gave her name as Jessica Cole. She claimed to be a journalist researching the case. She was allowed 30 minutes in a monitored room where conversations were recorded but not interrupted. Ethan, heavily medicated and barely present, agreed to speak with her. But within minutes of sitting down, Jessica's expression changed. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that the recording equipment barely captured, and said something that made Ethan's eyes snap into focus for the first time in weeks. "Hello, Ethan. Do you remember me? Because I remember you. I remember everything you took from me." She wasn't a journalist. Her real name was Hannah Reeves, Lila's younger sister. And she'd been watching Ethan for 5 years, waiting for the right moment to make him pay. Hannah had never believed her sister simply ran away. She'd known Lila too well, known she'd been excited about the wedding, knew something terrible must have happened. But police found no evidence. Ethan played the heartbroken fiancé convincingly. The case went cold, and Hannah was left with nothing but suspicion and grief. So she'd started investigating on her own, tracking Ethan's movements, monitoring his social media, creating fake accounts to observe his life from a distance. She'd watched him go to therapy, watched him recover, watched him 3 years later start dating again. And then 2 years ago, she'd done something that crossed every legal and ethical line. She'd inserted herself into Ethan's life, not as Hannah Reeves, sister of the woman he'd allegedly murdered, but as Claire Bennett, a completely fabricated identity built from stolen photographs, forged documents, and an intimate understanding of exactly what kind of woman Ethan would fall for. She'd studied his patterns, his preferences. She'd known he frequented a specific coffee shop on Capitol Hill every Saturday morning. She'd arranged to be there to accidentally spill her drink on him, to laugh at the coincidence when they kept running into each other. She'd been everything he wanted, patient, understanding, Interested in his boring hobbies, willing to let him set the pace. She'd become his girlfriend, then his fiancée, then his wife, all while slowly, carefully, meticulously gathering evidence of what he'd done to Lila. The plan had been elegant in its cruelty. Hannah would marry Ethan, take him on honeymoon to the exact hotel where he'd hidden Lila's body, then disappear. Leave him alone with no evidence she'd ever existed, force him to call police, watch him unravel when confronted with impossible questions. She'd expected him to confess, to break down, to finally admit what he'd done. Instead, Ethan had done something she hadn't anticipated. He'd genuinely forgotten. His reaction wasn't guilt or panic. It was confusion, real, authentic confusion. In watching him insist to police that his wife existed, that she was real, that he loved her, Hannah realized she hadn't been punishing a killer. She'd been torturing someone who no longer remembered committing murder. The revelation changed nothing legally. The evidence still pointed to Ethan, but it changed everything ethically. Hannah sat across from him in that monitored room and confessed her entire scheme. She'd created Claire. She'd planted evidence. She'd manipulated him into falling in love with a ghost designed to destroy him. And in the process, she discovered something that haunted her more than her sister's death. Ethan had loved Claire, genuinely, completely loved her, which meant he'd probably loved Lila too. Whatever had happened 5 years ago, it hadn't been premeditated hatred. It had been something more complicated, more human, more terrible. Hannah asked him one question before the guards ended the visit. "What happened to my sister?" Ethan stared at her for a long time, and then, as if a door had opened somewhere deep in his fractured mind, he remembered. The confession came in fragments over the next 3 days. Detective Morales recorded every word. Dr. Wong sat beside Ethan, monitoring his mental state, ensuring the memories were real and not more confabulation. And slowly, the truth emerged. Ethan and Lila had driven to Maine a week before their wedding, a pre-honeymoon trip, just the two of them, to the cliffside inn that Ethan had read about online. It was supposed to be romantic, a chance to escape the wedding stress. Instead, they'd argued. About what? Ethan couldn't remember clearly. Something small that became something big. Words spoken that couldn't be taken back. Lila saying maybe they were rushing things. Ethan feeling rejected, humiliated, terrified that she was going to leave him like everyone eventually left him. They'd gone walking on the beach at sunset. The rocks were slippery from an earlier rain. Lila had been angry, walking fast, not watching her footing. And Ethan, in a moment of rage or impulse or accident he genuinely didn't know, had pushed her. Not hard, just enough to make her stumble. But stumbling on wet coastal rocks, with the ocean churning below, was enough. Lila had fallen, hit her head, gone into the water unconscious. And Ethan had watched her disappear beneath the waves, too shocked to scream, too terrified to call for help. He'd pulled her out eventually, too late, carried her body back to the hotel in darkness, hidden her in his car, panicked about what to do. He'd found the cellar entrance by accident, looking for somewhere, anywhere to hide evidence of his catastrophic mistake. And then he'd driven back to Seattle alone, convinced himself it had been an accident, then convinced himself it had never happened at all. The wedding invitations were already sent, guests were arriving, Lila's parents were waiting. So Ethan had told the story his mind created to protect him. She'd gotten cold feet. She'd left a note. She'd chosen to disappear. And within months, he'd almost believed it himself. Until 5 years later, when guilt he couldn't consciously acknowledge had driven him back to Maine with a replacement bride. Back to the scene of a crime he'd buried so deep, even he couldn't find it. Dr. Wong called it dissociative fugue state, an extreme psychological response to trauma. Ethan's conscious mind had genuinely forgotten killing Lila, but his subconscious knew, and it had been trying desperately to force him to remember, to confess, to face what he'd done. Claire had been a ghost, yes, but not Lila's ghost, the ghost of Ethan's own guilt, given form and life by Hannah's elaborate revenge. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Ethan pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter. His lawyers argued diminished capacity, lack of intent, mental illness. The prosecution pushed for murder too, premeditation, the cover-up proving consciousness of guilt. In the end, the jury compromised. Guilty of manslaughter. Guilty of improper disposal of remains, 15 to 25 years. Hannah Reeves was charged with identity fraud, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. Her lawyer argued she'd been acting from trauma and grief, that she'd helped solve her sister's murder even if her methods were illegal. She received 3 years probation and a suspended sentence, contingent on continued psychiatric treatment. Lila's parents attended every day of both trials. They sat in the front row, holding hands, watching the man who'd killed their daughter and the daughter who'd sought revenge. In victim impact statements, they said they forgave Ethan. Not because what he'd done was forgivable, but because holding on to hate would mean losing another child. They didn't forgive Hannah. She hadn't asked them to. Detective Morales closed the case with more questions than answers. He'd solved a murder, yes, but he'd also witnessed something that challenged his understanding of guilt, memory, and justice. Ethan had killed someone and genuinely forgotten. Hannah had solved a crime by committing others. The truth had emerged not through good police work, but through psychological warfare. In his final report, Morales wrote something that never made it to official record. Some cases close, others just stop haunting you. This one will do neither. Ethan Crawford currently resides at Monroe Correctional Complex in Washington State. He's a model prisoner, quiet and compliant. He attends therapy sessions twice weekly. He's been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, severe PTSD, and complex grief syndrome. He takes medication that keeps the memory stable, prevents new fractures from forming in his already shattered psyche. And according to the prison psychologist, he spends most of his free time drawing the same woman's face over and over. Sometimes she has brown hair, sometimes blonde, sometimes her eyes are blue, sometimes brown. He calls her Claire. He says he's trying to remember what she looked like. The psychologist hasn't told him that Claire never existed. It seems cruel to take away the one memory that brings him peace. Hannah Reeves lives in Portland now, working remotely as a database administrator. She changed her name legally. She doesn't speak about what happened. Her therapist notes she suffers from complicated grief and moral injury, the psychological wound that comes from violating your own ethics even in pursuit of justice. She's tried to move forward. But on October 15th every year, the anniversary of that fake honeymoon, she receives a letter from Monroe Correctional Complex. Ethan writes to her. Short messages. He thanks her for being Claire. He apologizes for forgetting her name. He asks when she's coming to visit. The letters are never threatening, just sad. And Hannah never responds, but she keeps every one. The Cliffside Inn closed permanently in 2023. Tourism never recovered after the news broke. The building sat empty for 2 years before being purchased by a developer who plans to convert it into condominiums. Room 214 will become someone's bedroom. The cellar has been permanently sealed, but locals say the property feels different now. Heavy, like soil that's absorbed too much tragedy to ever grow anything healthy. Contractors working on the renovation report strange occurrences, champagne glasses appearing where none were left, rose petals on the floor of the former honeymoon suite, the sound of a woman crying in rooms that should be empty. They're probably just stories, the kind of legends that grow around places where terrible things happen. But the contractor hired to seal the cellar quit after his first day. He won't say why, just that he heard someone calling for help from behind walls where no one could possibly be. This story raises questions that don't have comfortable answers. Was Ethan responsible for Lila's death if he genuinely couldn't remember committing it? Was Hannah's revenge justified even though her methods were illegal? Does justice mean punishment, or does it mean truth? And perhaps most disturbingly, how many of our own memories are real? How much of the past do we actually recall versus reconstruct? How many people walking around right now have buried something so terrible their minds have rewritten reality to protect them? Ethan Crawford believed his wife existed. He felt her touch, heard her voice, loved her completely. And when she disappeared, his grief was real. Does it matter that she was never actually there? If the pain was genuine, was the love somehow genuine too? We want to believe that memory is stable, that we know ourselves, that we can trust our own minds to tell us what's true. But this case proves otherwise. Sometimes the most elaborate lies are the ones we tell ourselves. The human mind is both resilient and fragile. It will do anything to protect us from unbearable truth. It will invent whole people, create entire histories, blur the line between what happened and what we can survive believing happened. And sometimes the only way to escape the past is to forget it entirely, until someone makes you remember. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this before you comment. If you'd been in Hannah's position, sister of a murdered woman, knowing the killer would never face justice through legal means, would you have done what she did? Would you have created an elaborate scheme to force a confession, even if it meant committing crimes yourself? Or if you'd been Ethan, living with guilt so profound, your mind erased it entirely, would you want someone to make you remember? Would you choose the pain of truth over the peace of carefully constructed delusion? There's no right answer, just the terrible recognition that love, grief, guilt, and revenge are sometimes impossible to separate. They blur together like memories that change each time you recall them, like faces that shift depending on the light, like the difference between a person who existed and a person you needed so badly to exist that you made them real. Ethan still doesn't know that Claire was Hannah. His doctors have decided that truth would be unnecessarily cruel. So he sits in his cell and draws the face of a woman who was his wife for 6 months. A woman who loved him, a woman who never existed except as an instrument of revenge designed by the sister of the woman he killed. And every anniversary, Hannah receives his letters and tries to reconcile what she did. She gave Ethan love, real love, even if it was built on a foundation of lies and rage. She gave him 6 months of happiness before tearing it all away. Was that mercy or cruelty? Justice or torture? She still doesn't know. Neither do I. Neither will you.